Okay, this is a short video about a small but important topic, opportunity fire. Now, in this game, most firing, as you would expect, is done in the firing phase. Artillery fires in the bombardment phase, but there are occasions on which a unit can fire during the movement phase, and that's called opportunity fire. Now, there's two criteria that have to be true in order for you to use opportunity fire. The first is that your target must have moved at least half of its distance within your arc of fire and line of sight, so not obscured by intervening terrain. And the second one is that the target at the end of its move must not be a valid target for firing in the subsequent firing phase. In other words, it's moved out of sight or it's moved out of your arc of fire. So if we take this example here, we've got a British battalion and a German Panzer IV battalion moving across the front of it. If it just moves normally, it's moving across the front of the battalion, so it is in the arc of fire. There's no problem with that part. But at the end of its move, it is still a perfectly valid target. It's within range, it's within the arc of fire, which is 45 degrees either side of dead ahead. So the firing that will happen in the firing phase as per normal. Be firing from behind the rear, so it'll be quite an effective shot. Now, let's assume instead that there is a wood intervening, that the British battalion is here, and that the German battalion moves, as it did before, straight across the front. But in this case, at the end of its move, it's going to be out of sight. The British battalion, remember, line of sight for fire is taken from the centre of the centre company, cannot see the panzers anymore. And so that part of the criteria is satisfied. It moved with half the distance and more within the arc of fire. So the criteria are met and opportunity fire can take place. Now, the rules are a little bit unclear at this point. What they say is that you must declare at the start of a unit's move that you're tracking it for opportunity fire, and it then goes on to say you must take your fire at that point. Now, to me, that doesn't make any sense. It seems to imply that you fire at the start of the target's move. Now, to me, as I say, that doesn't make sense because you don't know at that point whether it's actually going to move out of your arc of fire or your line of sight until it's actually completed its move, moved behind the wood or whatever. So my interpretation is that you take your shot at the point at which it is clear that the target is about to disappear. I should mention, by the way, that another way, without an intervening wood, that this tank battalion might have triggered opportunity fire is that if it has simply moved out of the arc of fire. So if it has moved its 9 like this, although it is still perfectly visible, it is no longer within the 45-degree arc. And so, again, opportunity fire, certainly by my interpretation, will be taken at the point at which it is about to disappear out of the arc of fire. Okay, now, given the move distances in this game, which aren't all that great, it's not all that often that a unit will just disappear behind a wood. But one very common reason for opportunity fire being triggered, and perhaps the most important, is when a unit is closing to initiate close combat. So let's take another example. Suppose we've got a couple of British battalions here, one supporting the other, and a German battalion, an infantry battalion, has decided it's going to move into close combat with this battalion here. So it's close enough. It's got a movement distance of 4, so it's within that range. Let's assume that it's taken the morale tests, both morale tests for charging into combat and also for standing, have been taken and passed, and so the German battalion is going to move into contact. Now, the criteria for opportunity fire are met in this case. Clearly, the target is in the arc of fire of the British battalion, and indeed of this one as well. And the second part is that it's not going to be an eligible target when the firing phase arrives, because at the end of its move, it's actually in contact, in close combat with the British battalion, and the rules state that you cannot fire into or out of a close combat. So neither the target battalion, the British battalion here, nor this one here in support, can fire once the Germans have made contact, and therefore opportunity fire is triggered, and again, under my interpretation, that fire takes place just before contact. So short-range weapons, if they've got bazookas, for example, or Piats anti-tank rifles, those will fire at short range, or they'll form part of the firing process. Opportunity fire is adjudicated just like any other. You roll the firing dice, you take into account any tactical situations, you include any attached companies and so on. There aren't any in this example, obviously. And then you calculate the results as normal. One thing, and I've mentioned this in the close combat video too, if the attacking battalion takes enough damage markers disorder markers to stop it, then the close combat won't happen. And in fact, in this case, that's probably quite a likely outcome, given that it's that the charging unit is being fired on by 2 battalions and it's in the open. Once opportunity fire has been taken, then the unit that fired cannot then fire in the subsequent firing phase, unless it's an anti-tank gun, because they can fire twice anyway. So your opportunity fire, if you choose to take it, is your only fire for that turn. Obviously, in this example, you almost certainly would, because you want to try and stop the close combat. But in other cases, you may decide that you don't want to fire on those tanks because you haven't got a particularly good anti-tank shot, and you're going to hold your fire for some subsequent reason. So that's opportunity fire. As I say, the 2 important points are that the unit is moving and moves at least half its distance. So if it's only got a millimetre to go at the start of its move before it disappears, then you can't take opportunity fire. But it's moving within your arc of fire, and that it is either leaving the arc of fire, going behind terrain, which means it'll be hidden, or for some other reason becoming an ineligible target for the firing phase. The other thing I should say is, again, this is a house rule on my own personal interpretation. If we have a close combat attack like this, even though that battalion is not going to move half its move before it makes contact, I still adjudicate that as allowing opportunity fire, because it is very clear that a battalion is going to respond to a frontal attack by firing all its weapons at the target. A couple of little points. Opportunity fire, even in this closing case, does not apply if the attacker is out of the defender's arc of fire. So in this example, even though the Germans are moving to close combat contact, the British do not get opportunity fire because the Germans are out of their arc of fire. And the other thing I should say is everything I've said about close combat here also applies to overruns, which I'll talk about in an upcoming video. Overruns are sort of the AFV's version of close combat, and again, a unit that's about to be hit in an overrun situation, if it's lined up the right way, will get opportunity fire at its attacker before the attack goes in.